The night it began, I noticed the wrong lipstick on the right glass. It was a coral shade I'd never wear pressed into a single champagne flute beside our sink. The print so perfect, it might have been stamped there by a careful, practiced mouth. Mark had come home late from client drinks humming the way he does when he's already convinced himself the story will land. And he set that glass down like it belonged. I rinsed it under warm water and watched the color bleed into the basin, a soft cloud letting go, and somewhere deep in my chest, a quiet hinge gave way. He kissed the top of my head, asked how Lily's calculus test went, and the ordinary questions sounded like props on a stage I hadn't realized we were standing on. Before I take you any further, tell me where you're listening from tonight, and if you've ever learned the truth from something small, a scent, a smudge, a word left where it shouldn't be. If this kind of slow justice is your cup of tea, tap like and subscribe so you won't miss what comes next. I promise I'll keep it honest, steady, and worth your time. My name is Elena, and I've spent 20 years learning other people's children. I'm the counselor who keeps tissues in the bottom left drawer and peppermint tea in the cabinet, the one students trust with the cracks they can't name yet. I grew up in a house where my mother stretched paychecks with soup, and my father measured twice cut once and hung every shelf level. We were plain people with a clean porch and a borrowed cake stand for special days. Mark came from a louder life vacations with matching t-shirts country club tennis, the kind of birthday dinners where the waiter sings and everyone claps because that's what you do when you're never worried about the bill. We met at a fundraiser, me in a navy dress I'd worn to 3 weddings, him in a sport coat that cost more than my monthly rent back then, and he made me laugh with a joke about the rubber chicken that wasn't actually rubber, but certainly tasted like it. He liked that I could listen without looking bored. I liked that he believed in roofs that didn't leak and tires that were changed on time. We bought our modest colonial on Maple Court the year Lily started kindergarten, and for a long stretch, our life sounded like Saturday morning's lawnmowers, in the distance, a coffee maker gurgling daughter tiny footsteps upstairs. When his friends came over for games on the big TV, I made a grazing board out of whatever we had, and they called me a magician. When my father-in-law needed someone to drive him to the VA clinic, Mark rearranged his calls and went without complaint. Tessa arrived harmless, or that's how it looked my age. Bright laugh. The kind of woman who knows where the extra folding chairs are without being told. She planned the booster gala in our gym and charmed the principal on day 1, then showed up in our kitchen with lilies for me because, Elena, I've heard about your work with the seniors. Everyone says you save lives quietly, and I believed her when she said it mattered. She and Mark clicked over spreadsheets and sponsorships. He admired how she could turn a messy committee into a clean timeline. And she admired his trick of getting companies to give twice what they intended. I told myself it was teamwork, the good kind, the kind you bless. Surface harmony has a way of smoothing its own edges until you learn to feel for the seam. Mark's travel ramped up, and I reminded myself 4th quarter is always heavy. He texted photos from airport gates and hotel lobbies that all looked the same, and I answered with pictures of Lily at the stove, making her grandmother's chicken and dumplings with too much time. Tessa started dropping by after meetings with leftover cupcakes, so they won't tempt me tomorrow, and we'd talk about centerpiece budgets while she rinsed mixing bowls at my sink, her bracelet clicking against our porcelain, a bright little metronome in my quiet kitchen. She knew my pantry better than some of my relatives, and when she laughed, Mark laughed too, like they'd arranged the punchline in advance. I held the small change, first his cologne over the scent of bourbon, even on nights he swore he didn't drink. The extra charger in his briefcase that matched the model Tessa carried. The way he began to say we about projects that didn't include me, only his team and her clipboard. At school, I told a senior to trust her pattern recognition. Your instincts aren't drama, they're data. And then went home and folded Mark's shirts to the rhythm of the dryer, telling myself routine is a kind of prayer. It was easier to believe in our old story than to ask if a new one had been quietly written underneath. The coral lipstick on the glass was the first mark that didn't scrub out. I didn't accuse him. I didn't announce that I'd noticed. I simply set the clean flute back where he'd left it and memorized its place. That night, he slept lightly, turning over like a man dreaming of elevators that never open, and in the morning, he made Lily's lunch, with too much care tucking the napkin in, as if kindness could make paper hold shape. When he kissed my cheek, the gesture landed as if it had crossed a long, cold hallway. I watched him walk to the car phone already in his hand, and felt something in me choose to stop smoothing, just for a moment, just long enough to admit the seam was real. By the end of that week, I could trace the outline of what I wasn't ready to say. Tessa texted me a photo of the booster banner hung perfectly straight and added a heart for good measure. Mark sent a thumbs up to our family group chat from an airport that might have been anywhere. I stood in our quiet house, the dishwasher humming Walter's old level sitting on the counter from a shelf Lily and I had rehung, and I thought about what makes a line honest. The glass gleamed in its spot, reflecting the window and the bare maple limbs outside, and I understood that sometimes you start protecting yourself before you find the words for why. The first real proof, the kind that speaks louder than a smear of color, arrived the next Tuesday, tucked where only a careless man or a confident woman would leave it. That following Tuesday confirmed what the glass of lipstick had only whispered. Mark came home from work later than usual, his tie loose, his jacket folded over his arm, like it had been carried too far. He set his briefcase down by the door, glanced toward the kitchen, and froze for the briefest moment when he noticed I was still at the table. His eyes darted to the counter, and that hesitation, no longer than a heartbeat, pressed into me like a weight I couldn't ignore. I kept my voice calm. "You didn't mention working late today." He gave a short laugh, too light, and said he'd been caught up with calls and had gone for a drink with a client. His tone was smooth, but there was a stiffness in his shoulders that didn't belong to a man fresh from casual conversation. I nodded and let him talk, my hands folded in my lap as I studied the way his cufflinks caught the light. The next morning, I drove Lily to school, and on the way back, I stopped at the gas station near the bypass. That's where I saw them. Mark's car was parked at the far end of the lot, away from the pumps. He sat inside with Tessa in the passenger seat, both leaning over a folder that looked too ordinary to require such closeness. Her hand brushed his arm as she laughed at something, and he tilted his head toward her in a way I had once believed was reserved for me. I sat still in my car, the engine idling, my knuckles white around the steering wheel. I didn't confront them. I drove off, my heart beating so hard I felt it in my throat, and when I reached home, I unloaded groceries I hadn't even bought. I told myself perhaps it was work, just business, though the echo of her laughter in his car didn't sound like business. That evening, he arrived with takeout from a place he never chose on his own, handing me a bag of food as though generosity could cover a truth not yet spoken. The days began to shift in small, deliberate ways. Tessa came by more often, always with an excuse. One time, she dropped off binders for the gala committee. Another time, she brought pastries. She said were too sweet for her, though she knew Mark favored them. She slipped easily into our kitchen, her perfume hanging in the air long after she left. And Mark always seemed to find something to discuss with her while I cleared the dishes. Walter stopped by on a Friday afternoon, leaning heavier than usual on his cane, and I brewed him tea in the quiet of our sunroom. He told me he was glad Mark had such good people around him at work, that it was a blessing to see his son surrounded by friends who cared. I smiled, but the words lodged like a stone in my throat. Walter trusted too easily the same way I once did. One evening, I reached for Mark's jacket to hang it up and felt the weight of a receipt in the pocket. It was from a restaurant 2 towns over, a place neither of us had visited before. The date matched the night he told me he was stuck at the office. I slipped the paper back, my hand steady even as my chest tightened. Later, when he asked if I wanted to watch a show together, I told him I was tired and went to bed early. In the dark, I lay awake, listening to the hum of the refrigerator and the faint sound of his footsteps downstairs. He moved with a restlessness I hadn't heard in years, as though pacing could dissolve guilt. I stared at the ceiling and thought about the coral lipstick, about the pause at the kitchen counter, about the car in the gas station lot. The pattern was no longer hidden. By the weekend, I began pulling back. When he asked what I wanted for dinner, I told him I'd already eaten. When he reached for my hand during church, I left mine folded neatly in my lap. He noticed, of course. His eyes flickered with confusion, but he said nothing. He preferred silence to questions he didn't want to answer. Lily, sharp as ever at 17, asked if everything was all right between us. She said it softly while drying plates beside me, her brows drawn in that thoughtful way she had inherited from my father. I kissed the top of her head and told her to focus on her studies. But inside, I knew she saw more than I wanted her to. Children often do. The turning point came the next Tuesday evening. I walked past the guest room, Mark's so-called office, and saw the door pulled almost shut. Through the narrow gap, I glimpsed the glow of his phone screen. He was laughing quietly, his voice pitched in that private register he used when speaking tenderly. I didn't hear the words, but the tone was enough. My steps slowed, then carried me past without interruption, my face as calm as if I had only been heading to fold laundry. Later that night, when he slid into bed beside me, the scent of unfamiliar perfume clung faintly to his shirt. It was floral, heavier than anything I owned. I rolled to my side away from him and closed my eyes. My breath was even, but inside something shifted into certainty. He believed I would continue as always, that I would smooth over late nights, strange receipts, and borrowed laughter. But I had begun to keep count, not in anger, but in quiet preparation. The lipstick glass had been the first mark. Every step since had traced the outline of a truth I could no longer ignore. And as I lay there in the dark, I realized the time was coming when silence would no longer serve me. The first real confrontation wasn't far away, and when it arrived, nothing in our household would look the same again. The silence in our house turned into its own language, one I understood, even when Mark pretended not to. At the dinner table, his fork scraped against his plate, while I chewed slowly, waiting for him to fill the air with explanations that never came. When he did speak, his words carried the weight of obligation rather than affection, and I found myself listening for what he avoided more than what he said. Nights grew longer with me lying awake in the guest room I had quietly begun to use, staring at the ceiling and hearing the faint vibration of his phone lighting up across the hall. Each small detail collected inside me like pebbles in a jar. A perfume note that didn't belong to me. A second wine glass on the counter when I knew I hadn't poured one. His shirts smelling faintly of smoke from a bar I hadn't stepped into. He explained each sign with a smile too careful as if rehearsed. I nodded outwardly calm, but inside I felt the ache of being treated as someone too fragile to recognize the truth. The weight of it pressed into my chest until even the simple rhythm of folding laundry carried sadness. I turned toward Lily for grounding, watching her move through her senior year with more resilience than I felt I had. She filled the kitchen with college brochures, essays printed out for my careful review, and questions about what dorm life might be like. I answered every one with steady patience, grateful for her laughter, though I sometimes caught her watching me with quiet suspicion. She noticed my smile faltering quicker than I could hide it, and though she never asked directly, I knew she understood something between her parents was unraveling. Walter continued to stop by on weekends, his cane tapping lightly against the hardwood as he settled into the armchair by the fireplace. He'd ask about Lily's progress about the school, and finally about Mark. I offered polite answers, never more than necessary, He told me I had steadiness. He admired that families needed anchors, and I swallowed the compliment like medicine that burned on the way down. For him, I stayed composed, but every visit left me more aware of the widening gap between appearances and reality. One night, long after Lily had gone to bed, Mark came into the kitchen while I was drying the last dish. He leaned against the counter, arms folded, watching me closely. "You've been quiet lately," he said, his tone light, but his eyes sharp. I set the towel down and met his gaze, letting the silence linger. "Quiet doesn't mean blind," I replied softly. He shifted uncomfortably, then forced a laugh, dismissing my words as though they had been a joke. He kissed my forehead before walking away, but the touch felt hollow, like an apology never spoken aloud. In the mornings, I started waking earlier, making coffee before anyone stirred, letting the hum of the machine fill the empty kitchen. It gave me a moment of solitude before the day demanded composure. I used those hours to write in a small journal I had kept hidden in my desk drawer. Each entry was plain, simple notes of what I had observed the timing of his late arrivals. The messages he shielded from view, the excuses that didn't match. It wasn't spite that made me record them. It was survival, a way of holding on to my own sense of truth before I could be convinced to forget it. The toll of his distance showed itself in the smallest rituals. We once shared Sunday breakfast, him flipping pancakes while I prepared fruit lily setting the table. Lately, he sat scrolling on his phone while I moved quietly around him, our words limited to practical exchanges about groceries or schedules. The warmth that had once lived between us cooled, until we felt more like strangers navigating the same space out of habit. I mourned it silently, my grief private, even as I smiled at neighbors or greeted colleagues with practiced ease. Tessa's presence grew heavier, even in her absence. I'd see her name pop up on community emails, hear her voice on speakerphone when Mark forgot to lower it, or find her handwriting on notes left in his briefcase. Once I found a scarf tucked into the back seat of his car, pale silk, with a faint perfume I recognized from her visits. I placed it back without a word. But that night, when Mark slipped into bed, I shifted to the edge of the mattress and stayed there until morning. By late autumn, the strain seeped into my health. Headaches lasted longer, my appetite faded, and sleep came only in restless fragments. I sat through faculty meetings with a practiced expression, but my mind drifted to the uneasy quiet of my home. Even music lost its comfort. The piano in our living room sat untouched, dust gathering on its keys. I told myself I was waiting, that patience was strength, but in truth, I was carrying pain too heavy to voice. One evening, as I tucked blankets around Lily while she studied on the couch, she looked up at me with eyes that had grown wiser than her years. "Mom, are you okay?" she asked gently. I smiled, brushing her hair back from her face. "I'm fine," I said, though my voice cracked slightly. She didn't press further, but I could see her doubt. In that moment, I realized my silence wasn't only protecting me, it was sheltering Mark while it chipped away at my daughter's trust. The thought haunted me long after she fell asleep. I began to understand that endurance had its limits. Quiet suffering left too long becomes complicity. And though I wasn't yet ready to confront him outright, the seed of change had already been planted. I closed my journal one night, the lamplight casting long shadows across the page, and I whispered to myself words I hadn't dared before. "This can't continue." The house was still, but the weight of that sentence lingered. It carried me into sleep with a certainty I hadn't felt in months, a quiet promise that my silence was nearing its end. And when the moment arrived to break it, I knew the first crack would give way to something neither of us could repair. The breaking point came on a Wednesday evening in late November, when the last of the leaves clung stubbornly to the maple tree outside our front window. Mark arrived home later than usual, carrying a paper bag from a restaurant 2 towns over. He set it on the counter, smiling as if the gesture might erase the weeks of distance. I pulled out the receipt tucked in the bag and saw the date, the time, and the meal for 2. My hands didn't tremble, but something inside me finally settled into stillness. At dinner, I set the receipt gently beside his plate. "Did you enjoy this?" I asked, my voice calm even. His fork clattered against the dish as his eyes darted to the slip of paper. For a moment, he tried to laugh it off, claiming it was for a client meeting. But his face betrayed him, the muscle in his jaw tightening in a way that told me he knew I already understood. I waited silent until the weight of the truth pressed against him harder than my words ever could. "I think you've forgotten who you're married to," I said, finally, my voice steady. "I notice details, Mark. I listen, even when you think I don't." He opened his mouth, but no explanation came. The silence between us stretched like glass about to shatter. Lily's footsteps sounded faintly upstairs, and I reminded myself to keep my voice low. She didn't deserve to hear the sound of her parents breaking. That night, I moved the rest of my belongings into the guest room, closing the door softly behind me. For the first time, I didn't feel like I was hiding. I felt like I was reclaiming a space that belonged to me, a room no longer defined by his carelessness. I wrote everything down in my journal that night: the date, the restaurant, the look on his face when he realized he had run out of excuses. My hand felt steady, my pen leaving dark lines that carried no hesitation. In the days that followed, Mark tried small gestures, as though flowers or takeout could mend what had already fractured. I accepted each offering politely, then set it aside, untouched. The roses wilted in their vase, their petals falling silently to the counter, and I let them stay there, a reminder of how quickly beauty fades when it isn't rooted in truth. His voice softened when he spoke to me, but I recognized it for what it was: a man attempting to cover the cracks rather than face them. On Sunday morning, I sat at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee, watching the light creep across the floor. Mark entered, his face tired, his tie already knotted, though church was still an hour away. He lingered in the doorway, his eyes searching mine. "Elena," he began, his voice low, "we don't have to do this. We can go back." I set my cup down slowly, meeting his gaze. "Go back where, Mark?" "To pretending." The question hung in the air, heavy and sharp, and he looked away before answering. That evening, after Lily had gone to bed, he returned to the kitchen again, pacing. "You're punishing me," he said. His words clipped. I shook my head. "I'm simply living by the truth you gave me," I replied. His face hardened, but I saw the flicker of fear behind his anger. He knew I had stopped clinging to the story we once shared, and in that shift, the balance between us had changed. Walter stopped by that week, carrying a bag of apples from a neighbor's tree. He sat heavily in the armchair, his cane leaning against the side. As we sipped tea, he looked at me with those clear, steady eyes that had weathered decades of work and loss. "You look tired, Elena," he said quietly. I smiled faintly, tucking a strand of hair behind my ear. "Some weeks are heavier than others." He didn't press, but he patted my hand with a gentleness that nearly undid me. If he sensed the tension, he chose not to name it, and for that, I was grateful. I began making subtle changes in the house. Bills that once carried both our names were shifted into mine. Files that had sat for years in the drawer of his desk were quietly copied and organized into my own folder. At first, it felt like a defense, but gradually it became something else, a preparation. I didn't speak of it, not even to Lily, but each small step, made me feel less trapped and more certain. Mark noticed the distance growing and responded with desperation. He lingered at the kitchen door when I cooked, offering to chop vegetables, though he hadn't done so in years. He asked about my day in a tone too careful, waiting for me to give him more than I did. I answered politely, but never fully. My words had become measured, my affection withdrawn, and he felt it. He called it cruelty, but to me, it was clarity. The night before Thanksgiving, I heard him on the phone in his so-called office. His voice was hushed, but the walls in that house had carried too many secrets for me not to notice. "She's pulling away." He whispered, the words clipped with frustration. There was a pause, and though I couldn't hear the response, I could imagine whose voice was on the other end. When he ended the call, I returned quietly to the guest room, the journal open on my desk. I wrote only one line before closing it. I won't be the one to break, but I won't be the one to bend either. That Thanksgiving, the table looked the same as it always had, the turkey carved neatly, Walter seated at the head, Lily filling glasses with practiced care. Yet beneath the surface, the air felt taut. Mark's smile was forced, his laughter too quick, and I knew he was playing for appearances. I passed the potatoes, listened to Lily share her excitement about college applications, and carried the weight of knowledge he thought was still hidden. After the meal, while Mark carried dishes to the sink, I lingered in the living room with Walter. He looked at me again with those searching eyes. "You've always had more strength than you think," he said softly. My throat tightened, but I managed a small nod. Perhaps he didn't know the details, but he sensed the truth all the same. That night, I stood at the window of the guest room, watching the bare branches sway against the dark sky. My reflection in the glass looked different, steadier, sharper, no longer weighed down by the uncertainty of what I suspected. The truth was out in the open now, no longer a shadow I chased. And with that clarity came something unexpected: resolve. I lay down with the journal beside me, the last page still fresh with ink, and let sleep carry me forward. The days of silent endurance were behind me. The time for quiet preparation had arrived, and soon there would be no turning back. I woke the morning after Thanksgiving with a kind of clarity I hadn't felt in months. The house was quiet, the smell of roasted turkey lingering faintly, but beneath the calm was the steady drum of resolve. I could no longer spend my days simply collecting signs, quietly carrying the weight of them. If Mark had chosen to live a double life, then I would choose to live by the truth. The first step would not be loud or rash. It would be careful, deliberate, and mine alone. That weekend, while Mark drove Lily to a study session, I began sorting through our files. Bills, bank statements, insurance papers, items that had once seemed like background noise of married life now held the pieces I needed. I organized copies neatly into a folder of my own, every page labeled, every date circled. The journal where I had written my observations stayed beside me, each entry matching the numbers I highlighted. It was not anger that guided me, but precision. Anger burns out quickly. Precision endures. Mark returned that afternoon carrying a grocery bag, his voice cheerful as he asked if I wanted to try a new recipe together. I smiled faintly, thanked him, and told him I had grading to finish. His shoulders dropped just slightly, though he covered it with a laugh. He did not notice the papers tucked safely in the bottom drawer of my desk, or the steadiness in my tone that came from knowing I was no longer depending on him for stability. A few days later, I reached out to Pamela Grant, an old college friend who now worked as a bank officer. We met at a quiet cafe on Main Street, the kind where no one hurried and the coffee stayed hot for hours. Pamela had always been the kind of woman who listened with both patience and a sharp eye for detail. I laid out the situation carefully, not dramatizing, only stating facts. She tapped her pen against her notebook, nodding slowly. If you want security, Elena, she said gently, start by protecting your own accounts. Separate what you can build your own trail. Quietly. Her advice echoed the voice inside me I had already begun to follow. That evening, while Mark showered, I sat at the computer and checked balances I had too often left to him. Passwords I remembered from habit, opened doors I had not walked through in years. Transfers appeared small but steady to an account with a name that wasn't mine. I took a screenshot, the numbers clear against the pale screen light. My hands didn't shake. I printed the page, slid it into my growing folder, and closed the drawer softly before he returned. Mark noticed my quietness more as the days passed. He asked if something was wrong, his voice careful, his eyes searching. I'm just tired, I answered, which was not a lie. Tired of silence, tired of pretending, tired of carrying the weight for us both. He kissed my cheek, lingering as though the gesture could fill the distance. I let him, though my mind stayed steady on the plan unfolding. Walter stopped by again, his cane tapping softly as he carried a bag of pears from the market. He settled into his usual chair, watching me with that calm wisdom age often brings. You've been busy, he said, his tone light but knowing. I smiled, nodding, and poured his tea. He didn't ask further, but his hand, resting briefly over mine, told me he trusted I was finding my way. That small gesture strengthened my resolve more than he could have realized. By mid-December, I had shifted my paychecks into a separate account opened carefully with Pamela's guidance. Each move was discreet, leaving no trace that would alarm Mark. The bills continued to be paid on time. Groceries, bought, appearances kept. Outwardly, nothing had changed, but privately, I was building a foundation he could not touch. At night, when he leaned into me as though routine could erase truth, I lay still and thought of the folder in my desk, the journal by my bed, and the account quietly growing under my name alone. One evening, after Lily had gone upstairs to study, Mark set 2 glasses of wine on the table and tried to begin a conversation. He spoke of plans for the spring, of maybe taking a trip together, just the 2 of us. His eyes were hopeful, almost pleading, but I recognized it now as fear of losing the control he had once taken for granted. I listened politely, nodded at the right places, but I did not agree. When the silence stretched, he reached for my hand. I pulled it back gently, resting it on my lap. His eyes darkened, but he said nothing. I began to prepare myself for what was coming. Every document, every screenshot, every note in my journal was a step closer. Not to revenge alone, but to dignity. I would not confront him with nothing but tears and accusations. I would confront him with proof, and I would do it in a way he could not twist. The shift in me was subtle, but even Lily sensed it. She hugged me one evening after finishing her homework, holding on longer than usual. "You feel stronger," she whispered, though I wasn't sure she meant to say it aloud. I kissed her hair, swallowing the tightness in my throat, and told her she was stronger too. That moment, more than anything, reminded me who I was really doing this for. Mark's voice grew sharper in the following weeks. He accused me of being distant, of creating problems where none existed. I stayed calm, answering simply, never feeding the fire. His words rolled off me in a way they hadn't before. The balance between us had shifted, and though he didn't yet understand why he felt it, his unease became my quiet power. One night, I closed my journal and placed the pen carefully across the page. I looked around the guest room, no longer a place of exile, but a room of my own. The lamp cast a warm glow, the papers stacked neatly beside me, and for the first time, I felt prepared rather than burdened. The silence of the house no longer felt suffocating. It felt strategic. The first steps of defiance had been taken. They were quiet, deliberate, but they were mine. And I knew, with the steadiness of winter settling outside, that the day was coming when quiet preparation would no longer be enough. Soon, the truth I carried would need to be spoken aloud. The quiet steps I had taken in December soon carried me into January, when the weight of secrets could no longer be disguised by routine. Mark grew restless, shifting between forced affection and sharp words, and I watched him unravel. His late nights returned with greater frequency, his excuses clumsier than before. The folder in my desk had grown thick with papers and screenshots, but I no longer needed them to know the truth. His behavior told the story plainly enough. What I carried now was not suspicion, but proof, and the certainty that it was time to use it. The moment presented itself on a Saturday evening, when Lily was at a friend's house and Walter had already gone home from his weekly visit. Mark suggested dinner, his tone far too cheerful, as if a reservation might erase the months of distance. He chose a restaurant in town where couples often celebrated anniversaries. I wore a navy dress, simple and steady, not for him, but for myself. The candlelight flickered across the table, and I watched him fumble with small talk before he leaned forward, attempting to soften his voice. "We can still fix this," he said. I slid the folded receipt from his jacket pocket across the table, the one I had kept from weeks earlier, with Tessa's signature at the bottom. "You can't fix something you keep breaking," I answered quietly. His face drained of color, the forced smile collapsing. He tried to laugh to claim it was business, but the words fell flat. I pulled a second sheet from my purse, a printed transfer to the account in her name. His eyes darted to it, then back to me, and for the first time, he had nothing to say. The silence between us was louder than any accusation. The following morning, I called Pamela and arranged a private meeting with a lawyer she trusted, James Reed, a man known for his quiet precision. I carried my folder into his office, each page neatly ordered, and laid it across his desk. James listened carefully, his questions deliberate, his tone steady. "You've already done half the work," he said, scanning the documents. "What you need now is timing." His advice was measured, practical, and it aligned with the plan forming in my mind. Timing would be my weapon, not anger. At home, I remained composed. Mark grew sharper, accusing me of coldness, of building walls, of caring more about paperwork than marriage. I let his words pass without defense, answering only when necessary. The more he shouted, the calmer I became, and that imbalance unsettled him more than any confrontation could have. He stormed from room to room, his footsteps echoing while I sat at the kitchen table writing quietly in my journal. Lily sensed the tension, though I tried to shield her from it. One night, she hugged me in the hallway, her arms wrapped tight. "You don't have to explain," she whispered. "I see more than you think." Her words tightened something in my chest, but they also strengthened my resolve. I kissed her forehead, promising silently that she would not grow up believing silence was the only response to betrayal. The confrontation that finally broke the surface happened 2 weeks later. Mark returned home late, his tie askew, the scent of unfamiliar perfume clinging faintly to his shirt. He found me waiting in the living room, my journal and folder spread across the coffee table. His eyes flickered to the papers, then to me, and his face hardened. "You've been spying on me," he said, his voice rising. I shook my head. "No, Mark. I've been listening and writing down what you said, what you did, what you chose." I read aloud a passage from my journal, his own words about late meetings and forgotten nights. Then I held up the printed transfer again, steady in my hands. "This isn't silence anymore," I told him. "This is what you created." His face twisted with anger, but behind it was fear. He knew the lies had lost their cover. For the first time, I didn't back down. I didn't raise my voice, but I didn't retreat either. He tried to shout, tried to call me cruel, but I sat still, letting the weight of his own actions hang in the air. When the shouting stopped, he left the room, the slam of the door echoing through the house. I gathered the papers, calmly sliding them back into the folder. My hands remained steady, my breath even. The breaking point had come, and I had met it without flinching. The next day, Mark avoided me, moving through the house like a shadow. He left early, returned late, his presence marked only by the sound of doors closing. I carried on, preparing Lily's meals, grading papers, and writing each night by lamplight. The silence no longer suffocated me. It gave me space to breathe, to think, to plan. I knew the time for exposure was close. The documents were in order the lawyer prepared, and the balance between us had shifted beyond repair. What remained was the moment, the place where his mask would finally fall, not just in front of me, but in front of those he had deceived. And when that moment came, I would not need to shout. The truth would do the work for me. The evening of the gala arrived cold and sharp, the kind of January night when even the air feels brittle. I stood before the mirror in my guest room, fastening the clasp of a necklace Walter had given me years earlier. The navy dress I chose was simple, dignified, and carried no pretense. It wasn't for Mark, or for the people who would fill the Whitmore Grand Ballroom. It was for me, a reminder that I could walk into that room steady and unshaken. The Whitmore Grand glittered with chandeliers and polished marble, its corridors buzzing with voices of donors, board members, and local leaders. The Education Fund's annual gala was always an event, but this year carried particular weight. Franklin Grant, my father-in-law, was being honored for his lifetime of service in public schools, and the committee had arranged a tribute that would draw half the town. Mark had been preening for weeks about how it would reflect on the family, and I let him. But I knew something he didn't, that the truth he had buried so carelessly would not stay hidden through the night. When we entered the ballroom together, his hand resting lightly on my back, I felt the eyes of acquaintances on us. Smiles, nods, greetings that carried admiration for what they thought we were. Mark thrived in that space, moving smoothly among colleagues, shaking hands, laughing just a little too loudly. I stayed close to Walter, who walked with his cane but stood tall, proud of the evening arranged for his brother. Lily joined us, her gown modest and lovely, her hair swept back in a way that made her look older than her 17 years. She carried herself with quiet poise, though I could see in her eyes that she was bracing for what might unfold. Tessa appeared not long after, radiant in a red dress that drew attention the moment she entered. She moved straight to Mark, her hand brushing his arm as she congratulated him on some trivial achievement. Their laughter rang too clear, their closeness too comfortable, and I watched several heads turn curious, but not yet suspicious. I stayed composed, sipping water from a tall glass, waiting for the moment that had been carefully prepared. The program began with speeches, a slideshow of Franklin's years in education, photographs of classrooms, sports teams, and school plays. Walter's voice trembled as he introduced his brother, the applause rising strong and heartfelt. Franklin spoke with humility, thanking colleagues and community members, his words filled with the grounded honesty that had marked his life's work. Mark stood near the podium, basking in the reflected glow, his smile wide, as if the honor belonged to him. When Franklin finished, the chairman of the board, Harold Kim, stepped forward to announce the donors who had made the evening possible. A list of names scrolled across the screen behind him, but midway through a slide appeared that no one had expected. It was a transfer record projected large and undeniable, showing funds moved from the education account Mark managed into an account under the name of Tessa Grant. Gasps rippled across the room, chairs scraping as people leaned forward. Harold froze, turning slowly toward the screen, confusion clouding his face. Mark's expression shifted instantly, his practiced smile collapsing into panic. He stepped forward, stammering that it must be a mistake, a technical error. But before he could continue, Pamela rose from her seat near the front, her voice calm and steady. "Those transfers have been verified. Multiple accounts, multiple dates. The documentation has already been provided to the board." The murmurs grew into sharp whispers, eyes darting between Mark and Tessa, whose face had gone pale beneath her rouge. I remained seated, my hands folded neatly in my lap, my breathing steady. The truth was no longer mine to reveal. It stood on the screen for all to see. James Reed, the lawyer, Pamela had recommended, moved quietly through the aisle, handing envelopes to board members, each containing the full set of records. His presence carried authority, and the room fell into a tense hush. Mark's voice broke the silence, raised and desperate. He accused others of plotting against him, of fabricating evidence, of targeting him because of his success. But every word only deepened the impression of guilt. Harold called for calm, his tone firm, and announced that the board would be convening immediately after the program to review the evidence. Applause once meant to honor Franklin now felt scattered and uneasy, the air heavy with disbelief. Tessa slipped toward the back of the room, her eyes avoiding mine, her hands clutching her clutch bag like a lifeline. Mark reached for her arm, but she pulled away, leaving him standing alone near the podium. His gaze swept the crowd, searching for sympathy, but found none. Even Walter, standing with his cane, looked at his son with quiet disappointment, the kind that cut deeper than anger. I stayed silent, my face composed, watching as the man who had once thrived on control struggled to find footing. The gala continued awkwardly, the program limping toward its close, but the damage was done. Conversations buzzed in corners, donors exchanged uneasy glances, and Mark's reputation, once polished and admired, had cracked in plain sight. When it was over and the guests began to leave, I walked out beside Lily and Walter. The cold night air met us with sharp clarity, and I drew my coat tighter around my shoulders. Mark trailed behind his steps, heavy, his phone already buzzing with messages he would not want to read. For once, he had no words for me, no defense, no mask. Only silence. As we reached the car, Walter touched my arm gently. "You didn't say a word," he murmured, pride in his voice. I nodded, meeting his eyes. "I didn't need to," I replied softly. The truth had spoken loudly enough. That night, as I placed my necklace back into its velvet box, I felt the quiet weight of justice beginning to settle. The confrontation had come not in raised voices or private arguments, but in the presence of everyone whose opinion mattered most to him. His world had shifted beneath his feet, and there was no undoing it. Yet I knew this was not the end. The fallout would come quickly, the meetings, the calls, the judgments whispered and spoken aloud. Mark would face consequences he had never imagined, and I would stand steady through them. The gala had broken the surface, but the reckoning had only just begun. The morning after the gala, the house was so quiet I could hear the furnace hum through the vents. Mark sat at the kitchen table staring at a phone that no longer buzzed with invitations or congratulations. His shoulders slumped forward, his eyes hollow from a night without sleep. For the first time in years, he looked like a man stripped of the armor he had always worn. The silence between us was final, not filled with tension anymore, but with truth. Calls came quickly that week. The board suspended him from his position. Donors withdrew their support, and colleagues who once greeted him with eager smiles now avoided his name entirely. Tessa left town within days, her red dress from the gala already a memory no one wanted to revisit. Walter, steady as ever, came by to help Lily with the school project, and sat quietly with me afterward, his hand over mine. "You did what needed to be done," he said, and in his voice I heard both pride and relief. Mark tried at first to convince me it was salvageable. He spoke of therapy, of rebuilding, of second chances. But the words rang hollow, spoken more from desperation than belief. When he realized I would not bend, he left quietly one evening, with only a suitcase and a brief apology, muttered under his breath. The slam of the door did not echo. It faded soft, as if the house itself had been waiting to exhale. Lily and I began to reclaim our days. We filled the kitchen with music again, letting the piano keys carry laughter where silence once sat heavy. She told me about her college essays, her excitement for the future, her dreams that reached beyond our street and our town. I listened with a heart lighter than I thought possible, knowing she was watching, not just how I spoke, but how I stood my ground. I wanted her to remember her mother not as someone who stayed silent, but as someone who chose dignity over deceit. Walter continued to visit his presence steady and reassuring. Sometimes we sat without words sipping tea while the sun dipped low. Other times he told stories of his younger years of challenges he had faced and endured. His quiet strength reminded me that resilience runs in steady lines through families often unspoken but always present when it matters most. He never judged me for what had happened. He simply respected the way I had walked through it. I found my own rhythm again. Long walks at dusk, a new routine of journaling, not out of necessity, but out of peace. Small projects in the house that felt like starting fresh. I painted the guest room a pale gray, turning it into a space that belonged wholly to me. The act of choosing a color, of holding the brush steady, felt like closing one chapter and opening another. Looking back, I realized revenge was never about cruelty. It wasn't about shouting or breaking things apart with anger. It was about letting the truth speak louder than the lies and refusing to protect someone from the weight of their own choices. Justice came not in my words, but in his downfall, a downfall he built with his own hands. If there's a lesson in all of this, it's that silence is not the same as weakness. Sometimes silence is preparation, sometimes it's strategy, and sometimes it's simply the space you give yourself to grow stronger. When the time comes to act, clarity does more than rage ever could. I learned that protecting my dignity was not just for me, but for the daughter who was watching and the family who still believed in me. Now when I sit at the table in the evenings, the light spilling across the wood, I feel calm where I once felt burdened. My life did not end when Mark betrayed me. It began again, steadier and clearer. I carry no bitterness, only the quiet assurance that I stood firm when it mattered most. Before we close, I'd love to know which part of this journey spoke most to you. Share your thoughts in the comments below, and if these stories bring you comfort or strength, stay with us for more.